We're here today talking about Trump's crackdown on the leftists, and I think people will most often associate this with what's going on in Minneapolis right now, of course, and what was going on in Chicago toward the end of last year, where accusations that protesters were domestic terrorists that was flying around from the administration. In many cases, the charges that they later tried to bring just completely fell apart. But the reporting Josh has been doing focuses on another aspect of this that is arguably more serious in that the charges actually do go into court and they stick, at least so far. We're going to have a trial in one of these cases next week, I think. Yeah, next week. Um, so we're going to talk about all of that. To foreground it, I think something I always think about is the way in which, during the first Trump administration, the idea of Antifa or shadowy leftist groups, it was very prominent. It just kept showing up everywhere. Like in 2017, there was this thing that became kind of a joke among the center and the left that the Trump movement was fearful of these Antifa super soldiers showing up at Trump rallies and attacking people. And during 2020, you'll remember that, as the Black Lives Matter protests were happening, there was this parallel thing in small town America where Facebook groups would get all freaked out that like a bus full of Antifa guys was about to show up and, attack Main Street or something. And of course, with the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol, immediately the go-to there within hours of it happening was, oh, well, Antifa only incited these patriots to do this. And, it's all the work of Antifa. And in each of these cases, either things were overblown or entirely fabricated. And this kind of leftist network movement did not exist in any way that was not at all, it didn't exist in the way that the MAGA movement imagined and that Trump himself imagined. So as we come into the second Trump turn, and Trump has this idea that we're going to crack down on my enemies within the country, there's like this big question of like, what's that going to look like? Because the enemies he imagines don't, exist in the way he imagines. And so we're starting to see that now. So anyway, with that sort of wind up, I'll ask you, Josh. What now? We're more than a year into the second Trump administration. What are the contours of this crackdown on the left? What are we seeing? Big picture.
Yeah. So look, well, first of all, thanks, John, for having me on. I'm happy to join here from TPM global headquarters in Manhattan. Yeah. And look, I mean, I would agree with you in terms of Antifa. Just first off, like it has clearly been useful for the Trump administration as this big bogeyman they can create. And for them, it is kind of this like it's like the weather underground. It's like the weather underground in the '70s times, 90s crime scare plus like Al Qaeda plus ISIS. Like it's all that kind of like melds into this one big threat, leftist threat to the country. In terms of what the administration is doing to try to repress the left, I think we can think of it as happening in a few categories. One are these so-called immigration sweeps being staged in big cities like Chicago, Minneapolis right now. People expect it to happen elsewhere. Those are ostensibly to conduct this kind of sweeping immigration enforcement where they're just kind of yanking people off the street. But in reality, what ends up happening is the tactics are so heavy-handed and so kind of disregarding of basic civil liberties protections, and also just so visible that they provoke a large reaction from both activists and people in these cities who wouldn't normally consider themselves activists, who then end up in confrontations with law enforcement and are then kind of subject to repression. So that happened in Chicago, where people, who went out to protest ICE peacefully faced charges from the Trump administration. Those later fell apart in court, but it was a huge nuisance for them. And we were also seeing that start to happen on a larger scale in Minneapolis. And that's not even to mention the people who are maimed or killed, in protesting these DHS operations. So that's one front. But I think there's another thing going on that has been less covered, and that is the Trump administration building out what is basically like a legal architecture for for cracking down on the left on a large scale, on a national scale. And that's proceeded on three fronts. The big one is what happened after the killing of Charlie Kirk in September. I think a lot of people, it was a tragedy, but a lot of people understood kind of immediately that it was going to be weaponized by the Trump administration. And that was accurate. And what the Trump administration did was they issued a few executive orders. One designated Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization. That's meaningless. It doesn't do anything under American law. There's no concept under our law for a domestic terrorist organization. It was basically a press release in the form of an executive order. But there was another one that was far more meaningful, and that's called National Security Presidential Memorandum 7, NSPM 7. And what that basically did was reverse how criminal investigators are supposed to look at things. It laid out culprits and basically told prosecutors around the country, and also joint terrorism task forces, which is like FBI plus local law enforcement. Here are markers for domestic terrorism. We want you to go look after these people. And for that, it was belief in anti-capitalism, anti-Americanism, anti-Christianity. It was what the memo described as gender extremism or extremism on migration. A lot of markers for basically left-wing activists. And so I think what we started to see, and what my reporting has showed in the past couple of weeks, is that that's gone from being just kind of a memo, just being an abstract direction, to starting to be operationalized around the country.
Right. Yeah, and I remember when we first started covering the memo that you're describing, which, we shorthand as NSPM 7, um, it was just striking the broadness of the language in it, anti-capitalism, anti-Christianity. I don't know if you listeners might harbor some of those sentiments yourself, but like you probably have like a nephew who does or something, right? Like it's so there was this question of like, what, we're gonna go after anyone who has anti-capitalist sentiments in America? How's that gonna work? And we're starting to see, I think, okay, like what does this actually look like when the rubber meets the road? And so, Josh, I think shortly after that, and I'm not exactly sure when, but we started to see the administration explicitly say, Pam Bondi explicitly say, we're gonna go back through existing cases and find places where, these ideologies may be present. And then that'll, factor into the way we prosecute them. And we're now seeing that. So, and just yesterday, you published a story on, look at two of those cases. So maybe we can talk about that now. But I mean, both the Trump administration strategy of combing back through people who have committed sometimes minor, sometimes more major crimes, but that are not, sweeping terroristic efforts as we would understand them. Um, and yeah, then tell us a bit about the two cases that you focused on.
Yeah, so look, I think it's important here to rewind a little bit and think about what changes the government made after 9/11 to allow themselves to go after what was widely then seen to be a terrorist threat coming from the Islamic world. I think everybody's going to remember what the atmosphere in the country was in 2001, 2002. And what happened is that the government started using statutes, then also expanded them, that allowed them to charge people with material support for terrorism. And so
Mhm.
with that, and there were two ways they could do that. One was a law that allowed them to go after people who contributed in some way to a designated foreign terrorist organization. So an example there would be Hamas. If you give $100 to Hamas, it doesn't matter if you think they're going to use it to buy, bread, or if they're going to use it to buy guns. That's a crime under American law. But the other one is what the Trump administration seems to be applying now, from my reporting. And that is also material support for terrorism. But the difference there is that it doesn't require them to prove that you have ties to an actual terrorist organization. What the law says is that Congress has listed a number of statutes that qualify as crimes of terrorism. And if they can prove that you knowingly intended to commit one of these crimes, then they can go after you they can prosecute you for material support for terrorism. I think that because they don't have to prove any link to a terrorist group. I think it's kind of just intuitively obvious why that would be why that would potentially raise civil liberties concerns, right? Because who's to say that for example, one of the underlying statutes that can be a crime of terrorism is damaging government property. So let's say I go with my friend and we spray paint, you know, um, we don't like Donald Trump on a government building. Would that then qualify as a potentially as a crime under material support of terrorism? Possibly, right? But so because of that concern, the DOJ evolved all of these pretty strict procedures over how these charges were to be brought, how they were to be reviewed, to prevent that kind of partisan abuse, right? To ensure that these statutes were largely going to be applied in situations where the underlying allegations met the gravity of the crime. And I should also note here that these charges come potentially with a lot of time in jail. So material support for terrorism, if you have no prior record of any kind of criminal wrongdoing, even no investigations, no nothing, but if you're convicted on that and the government gets a terrorism enhancement, which they'd be eligible for, the minimum recommended to the judge becomes 17 and a half years in jail, regardless of the underlying crime. So the penalties here are steep. So, basically the government evolved all these guardrails to prevent these laws from being abused. There were controversies throughout over whether or not they were going too hard on certain people, whether or not they were focusing incorrectly, but largely, at least when it came to domestic terrorism prosecutions, the cases that they brought were mostly large scale plots to blow stuff up or, kill people, commit kind of large scale hate crimes. Um, and that, those guardrails have largely disappeared, as I think a lot of people have chronicled over the past year, that the DOJ doesn't have this anymore. And so
Mhm.
what has kind of happened with this over the past couple months is Pam Bondi, John, as you mentioned, directed prosecutors to, charge the maximum, basically charge certain people as aggressively as possible. In this case, it's what she has described as like domestic terrorists or Antifa. And so the stories that we're looking at now are these cases where there's an allegation of some kind of criminal wrongdoing, but it's now being inflated to uh, this level of charge that really has only been applied to like international terrorism or white nationalists falling below the bridge. So what it is recasting conduct that might have been criminal, but in a relatively minor way, on the level of like a huge terroristic plot.
Right. Okay. And at this point, it's probably good to get into some examples. So, do you want to talk about the first of two that we've looked at this week, the Black Lives Matter related incident in Alabama, I believe?
Yeah, for sure. So that case, it goes to a guy named Mercutio Southall. And so you have to go back to August of this past summer in Birmingham, where there had been a series of protests around a shooting of an unarmed black teen in Birmingham. At one of these protests in August, somebody allegedly left the protest, went to a local Walmart, and then set the Walmart on fire. A couple days later, state police arrested somebody on that. This is Mercutio Southall, charged him with arson. They also charged him with possession of psilocybin mushrooms. Okay. And I should note that Mercutio Southall is a relatively well-known Black Lives Matter activist in the Birmingham area. Um, around a month later, the feds come in, charge him with federal arson. Okay. Right now, we're all still kind of in the realm of what typically might have happened under previous administrations. But then a month later, in late November, the feds come again and upgrade the charge to material support for terrorism. And from talking to people, from talking to former prosecutors, lawyers involved in the case, people who kind of track these matters, the only reason why anybody could find for why they would have upgraded this was basically like a local arson of Walmart to material support for terrorism, which I should note was recently brought against the leaders of Hamas, other kind of big international terrorists or kind of very ambitious like white nationalists. The only reason why people could find for why this might have been brought against this local Black Lives Matter activist was because he had this relationship with Black Lives Matter. And because his alleged crime came as he, you know, supposedly left his protest. So I think that's the kind of example where there is an allegation that somebody did do something wrong, and perhaps that's credible. I don't know. But it's being upgraded and inflated to an extent that you would not have seen. And it seems like, and as far as we can tell, that inflation is happening because of the person's ideology. So it raises really, really serious concerns about under freedom of speech. Because, what this now suggests is that if you are a leftist or if you are attending one of these protests and there is a crime, and something goes wrong, then you might not just face prosecution for the crime itself, but for this like broader terrorism enhancement. Or not, I shouldn't say enhancement, but rather, but just like this kind of like more serious terrorism charge that comes with all of these penalties we've been talking about. And so the other point there too is that there are other cases out in the country where people who weren't even alleged to have committed the core crime are also facing material support charges because of their alleged proximity to the person who supposedly, did the act of wrongdoing. So, again, where I think this becomes a gray area is that because there is an underlying allegation that somebody did break the law, um, it's in some ways the administration has more leeway on what they can try and get away with, because it's harder to it's a little bit harder to talk about when there is an allegation, like a core allegation of arson. But at the end of the day, what we're talking about is uh, using the heaviest guns in the government's legal artillery against relatively minor targets, and going after them that intensely because the ideology happened to be disfavored.
Right. And one thing about your reporting that was very interesting to me is you took some of these cases you were looking at, including the case of Mercutio Southall that you just described, to people who prosecuted material support for terrorism during the Bush administration, which I think listeners may remember. There were a lot of questions about the way in which the U.S. was going about terrorism prosecutions during that era, too. And prosecutors who worked on those cases were saying that, we're in a whole different world here. Like, yeah, no matter how you might feel about what happened during the Bush administration, this is several steps away from that. And that, to me, as we were trying to figure out how novel this is, how to sort of think about our reporting on these cases, that for me helped everything fall into place. Anyway, to your point about, you go to a protest and then something happens and now you're involved in material support for terrorism. Do you want to talk about the other one that we looked at this week, which is the case out of Texas?
Yeah, so this is also an interesting case. And I think what's kind of interesting about this is that goes to a demonstration that took place outside an ICE detention facility in Texas on July 4th. And if anybody saw one battle after another, what the government basically alleges is that what happened there is like the opening scenes of that movie, where these demonstrators allegedly shot fireworks at the ICE facility. There was a cop who responded. He was shot allegedly by a protester, survived, returned fire. Everybody who was there, as far as the government knows, it seems, was arrested. Um, and it's now devolved into a really complicated case where it's unclear. Where the government has now brought material support charges against everybody who was. They think what maybe.
My doorbell just rang and my dog's going to go crazy for a few minutes. So I'm sorry, everybody. Hold on for that. But
yeah. So I think what's great here is that I like your dog. It's funny. Is that I think like one useful comparison might be January 6th. So if you think about how the government approached those cases, there were an isolated number of people who faced the most serious charges. That was seditious conspiracy, right? Those were people like Stuart Rhodes or Enrique Tarrio, the leaders of these groups who went in with a really concrete plan for what they wanted to accomplish, and that was stopping the certification of Biden's win on January 6th, 2021, right? What the government has done in this case is take this one person who allegedly shot the police officer, and apply the charge they're bringing against him, which is material support for terrorism, with the crime of terrorism being attempted murder of a law enforcement officer, and applying it to everybody who was there. So that raises, I think, even more troubling questions around freedom of speech, because again, what you have is the only reason why anybody, again, in this one, can really understand why they would be bringing a material support charge is because the government is describing these protesters as belonging to a so-called Antifa cell. And again, they've brought evidence to suggest that the alleged shooter brought guns, knowing that perhaps there would be a reason to use them. So that helps them. But they don't have evidence suggesting that many of the other people who were there were even aware that that was in the cards. What they do have is evidence that people who were there helped print what the government has described as insurrectionary zines, or insurrectionary material known as zines, which are basically these like small pamphlets that people like distribute and you might find at like a quirky bookstore. Um, in this case, I think the zines had some like anarchist material. There was like anti-ICE, pro open border stuff. Um, but what the government is doing in this case is using those to suggest that that is enough to tie certain people to the what they're describing as like an ambush, which is or basically like an attempt to invade this detention facility. So again, I mean, I think the overarching thread here is that what we're seeing is that part of it is also this that the Trump administration and like federal law enforcement, they're going on kind of every day about how the country is supposedly facing this epidemic of domestic terrorism, how we're all under siege by Antifa. But when you actually look at the cases that they're bringing relative to that, like it just does not match the rhetoric. Like what they're doing in this Texas case is basically taking one incident where somebody did shoot like a police officer and inflating it and trying to make the facts like meet like contort the facts to meet this like overarching narrative that it was this huge planned terrorist attack. And so from one side it's just kind of ridiculous. Like if you look at the reality of what happened, it just doesn't match that, and it doesn't match the severity of the charges. But if you're one of the people who went to this protest not realizing what was going to happen, you just thought that you were protesting an ICE facility on July 4th, you're now looking at like potentially decades in jail. Uh, and it's not even entirely clear why, other than you have to support a cause that opposes, administration policies.
Right. Right. And to that point, and to the comparison with one battle after another, some of the prosecutors you spoke to as you were sort of getting a sense of these cases compared it to, man, I don't know how to say this word. I've only read it. COINTELPRO, right?
Yeah.
The the movement to go after leftists and activists of various sorts in the late 50s and through the 60s. Or not the movement, the coordinated government operation through the FBI. And I think in some ways that comparison is apt. In other ways, it feels like history repeating itself as farce a bit because we did have militant groups and we did have public violence on a scale that we've got nothing like now. It does look like the movie One Battle After Another, which is based on a book that was about that era. And it does not. So instead of taking down whatever the Black Panthers or something, which I'm not saying was good, but it did just. I'm not sure the comparison to these kids in Texas who staged this protest, and it all seems very loosely organized. I'm just not sure there's the parallel there, or to the Mercutio South Hall thing in Alabama. These do seem more like kind of people bumbled into these things as opposed to are part of some mass movement to oppose the American state. So anyway, I'm just musing there. Do you have further thoughts on that?
Well, I think the similarity is that with COINTELPRO, what you had was a program where the government had ideologies and groups they knew they were going to go after, and then kind of, in some sense, it was putting the cart before the horse, right? Because when you think about a criminal investigation, what you want is there to be evidence of a crime or evidence that a crime is being plotted, and for that to be, stopped, or somebody needs to be held accountable for that, right? What the problem with NSPM 7, what's happening now, and also with COINTELPRO, what they have in common is that it gets that backwards. They are putting out markers for what they think will be a crime. And in this case, it's anti-American ideology, anti-capitalism, anti-Christianity. And back in the 60s, it was membership in the Communist Party or the Black Panthers or certain civil rights movement, certain civil rights movement organizations, and saying, okay, we're going to go now try and disrupt them and go after them. So I think that, to me, that is the big parallel, is that, that's what they have in common, right? Is that it's not following the evidence and leading you towards a perpetrator. It's saying, we know who the perpetrators are likely to be based off of these ideological markers, and then directing law enforcement to go after them with as much force as possible. There's another subtler thing here as well. COINTELPRO, it's an abbreviation for counterintelligence program. And there was a thought back then that the people they were targeting from, civil rights movement leaders to anti-Vietnam War protesters were in some ways acting on behalf of like foreign intelligence organizations. And I think in some of the messaging today around Antifa, around the pro-Palestine movement, you can see vestiges of that as
Hmm.
well. But it's too early to say that there's anything there beyond the rhetoric, I think.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's super interesting. I think we'll wrap up here in a second. And I want to say before we do that if you came to this because you're a subscriber to Where Things Stand, which is the newsletter written 4 days a week by our colleague Nicole LaFond, we do intend to do more of these under the Where Things Stand banner. Nicole will be involved in some of them. Other members of the TPM Talking Points memo team will be too. If you're not a subscriber to Where Things Stand, I encourage you to subscribe. And if you are, I hope you'll join us again next time we do one of these video things. But yeah, to kind of bring it back to where we started as we wrap up, I think, with Chicago and Minneapolis, we see the label domestic terrorist thrown around a lot. Even there was a report about a week ago of federal agents telling people who are members of Signal group chats to track the locations of federal agents. Well, now you're on a list. Now you're a domestic terrorist. Much looser language than what we're seeing with the two cases we just talked about, but I think still very concerning in the sort of with the COINTEL comparison that we were just discussing. So I guess I'm just curious, how do you think about the connections between those things, Josh? What does what you're reporting on in Texas and Alabama and elsewhere? What does that tell us about how this language is being used more loosely in response to people who protest ICE raids in these cities where there's these surges?
Look, I think Pam Bondi has said that she wants prosecutors to, in every case involving people who oppose the Trump administration, bring the most aggressive charges they possibly can. And so that's what we saw in Alabama, and that's what we're seeing in Alabama and Texas, right? Is that in those cases, the most aggressive possible charges are these war on terror era statutes, material support for terrorism. So I think we'll continue to see that, right? I mean, we're going to that's what we should expect. It's what people should be prepared for. At the same time, the track record is really bad. The DOJ charged like around 2 dozen people in Chicago, 2 or 3 dozen people in Chicago over the protests there in response to the DHS mobilization, or like siege of the city. I think half of those cases have fallen apart. Minneapolis, they're having trouble getting past judges. So I think it's important to keep in mind though, and like even with these material support cases, I think once again, like it's worth emphasizing that even with this administration, which basically is trying to will a left-wing terrorist underground into existence, the most they can do is, go after this guy who was arrested for drug possession after allegedly setting a Walmart on fire and charged him with material support, right? So I think that and it's also important to keep in mind that part of the point of this is suppression. They want to scare people. They want to dissuade people from going out to protest. They want to dissuade people from participating in, public life. So I think it's important to understand what they're doing also, and also recognize that they are interested in, spreading terror in people, or spreading fear, I should say. So look, yeah, but I also think, but I do think that we're probably going to see more prosecutions of this kind going forward.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, we will stay on it. Thank you everyone for joining us. Yeah, nice talking to you, Josh. I'll see you in person soon.
Thanks for
Bye.